right, folks. Brian Bledsoe with you once again with your May update. And I won't waste any time getting into it. We'll start right away with your drought monitor that was released last week, which again, probably is not going to change a great deal this week by the time it comes out. But bottom line, the areas that have been the driest have been favoring southwest and south central portions of Kansas. And you can see even some extreme drought starting to show up there across some parts of the region. Most of it just a severe drought. But the good thing about this trend is that we have been building the chances of showers and thunderstorms during the course of the forecast, especially the farther south and southwest you go. So hopefully we'll continue to do that, and I'll show you some evidence as to why I think we could actually continue to do that here in just a moment. In terms of what the forecast or the precipitation percentage of normal has been during the past 30 days, again, the drought monitor matches up very clearly with this, that over the past 30 days, we've seen very little in the way of rainfall that has been meaningful in that brown shaded area across south central and southwest Kansas. Now, there have been some areas that have picked up a boatload of rain during that time, but it's been mainly over far south central Kansas, southeast Kansas, the north central and northeast, and then parts of the northwest. It's really just been this trouble spot that has continued to be a big trouble spot for the past few months or so that largely missed out on a lot of spring moisture around here. So, as I said, hopefully we can kind of continue to repair that over the next couple of weeks, because our Euro model right here, looking at the next couple of weeks, shows a pretty good shot at seeing above average rainfall across the majority of Kansas, and certainly some big time above average rainfall across most of Oklahoma and down into north central and northeast Texas. But again, those have been the areas that have really been benefiting from this pattern, with drier conditions the farther northwest you go. This is the Euro model forecast. This model is the GFS model precipitation anomaly forecast for the next couple of weeks. And it paints a much wetter scenario, not only from southeast Colorado through southwest Kansas, but all the way down across the Panhandle region, most of Oklahoma, far north Texas, and toward the Gulf Coast. So this particular model suggests that the farther southwest you live, your moisture is going to be better, with drier conditions the farther northeast you go. Reality is probably somewhere in the middle of these two, but I think the GFS model here is probably a little bit too wet from what I've been looking at, and I'd probably favor the Euro a little bit more than this. Great if this verifies, but I'd probably favor the Euro a little bit more than the GFS with this particular setup. Sea surface temperature anomalies haven't changed a great deal. There have been one little caveat that has changed a little bit, and if you look up in the Northeast Pacific, you see that big warm pool of water there, that red pool that's right there, that has extended a little bit farther to the northeast, but it has not completely eradicated the cooler than average anomalies in the Aleutian Islands, the Gulf of Alaska, and right down the west coast of the United States. So that we're still seeing the negative PDO persist. We also have the cooler than average water from the Baja to Hawaii. That's a negative PMM. We have the cooling El Nino region down there off the west coast of South America, and the Atlantic Ocean remains very warm between Africa and Cuba. So as I've been saying most of this spring, the table has remained largely set. I don't see this deviating a whole lot going forward. The only other thing that I think we could see is maybe the PDO, the negative values come up just a little bit due to that warm pool in the North Pacific, but I'd like to see more evidence of that happening before I would actually sign off on it. But certainly the big story here is the cool state of the Pacific for the most part, and the warm state of the Atlantic, especially between Africa and Cuba. The sea surface temperature anomaly forecast from the Euro model kind of keeps its status quo. But the interesting thing about the Euro model here is it does not forecast a strong La Nina episode as we head toward the fall. We see it building there, and then it kind of fades as we get later on in this forecast. I'm not necessarily sure that that's going to be the case. So for that reason, I would favor the NMME model, sea surface temperature anomaly forecast, more so here, that not only forecasts a bigger La Nina, but also a stronger one, and it continues to bring it on fairly abruptly. The rest of the sea surface temperatures really remain not that changed from where we are right now. So as I said, the biggest deal is that the Pacific is likely going to remain in a cool state, especially with the La Nina building, and the Atlantic will remain in a fairly warm state. So if we look at the transition times, again, in case you've missed this, that I've been showing this spring, the years where we've seen El Nino transition to La Nina are the ones that are right there that you see. Okay. And June through August, we saw that most of Kansas actually wasn't all that bad in terms of precipitation anomalies during that time frame. The big dry spot favored New Mexico and West Texas, as well as parts of Northwest Kansas. The Corn Belt, for the most part, stayed fairly wet during those years. But if we pushed things beyond that, and looked at what happened in September to December of those years, we obviously showed you how much drier it gets, not just across Kansas, but really just to the south, from southern Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and all the way across the Gulf Coast states. Again, those are the years where we saw an El Nino transition to a La Nina episode. The one year that I still think has a fairly close analog to where we are right now is 2020. And I have May 25th, 2020 on the left, May 26th, 2024 on the right to compare them. And you see that the similarities, especially in the ENSO region off the west coast of South America, in the cooler than average water from the Baja to Hawaii, that's there. The differences in 2020 was that the Northeast Pacific was warmer overall versus what we have right now, and the north part of the Atlantic was cooler in 2020 than where we are right now. However, if you're looking for an analog, 2020 and 2024 do match up fairly well in terms of what the atmosphere was doing then and what it is doing right now. In June of 2020, this is what happened. So you had a pretty good dry anomaly setting up there across the midsection of the country. Is that going to happen during the month of June? I think there are some things that will happen with this and things that won't happen. Keep this in mind as we finish this week and go into June. The weather pattern is probably still going to remain fairly active in the midsection of the country for the next couple of weeks. Remember those maps that I showed you early on. I do think that areas farther west will stay more dry than not. So these are some things to take in mind that the analogs, even though they match pretty closely, it doesn't necessarily mean that the outcome will be the same. We'll have to massage this going forward. But if we look at what happened in July of 2020, all of Kansas was pretty wet. Oklahoma was wet. The dry anomalies showed up farther to the southwest across parts of Arizona, southeast New Mexico, and southwest Texas. If we take it a step further and go into August, that's when everybody started to dry out. And this is really when the dryness continued to build in, not only across the Rockies, but also the adjacent plains, was late summer and in the spring. That year, even the Corn Belt dried out pretty severely across Nebraska, Iowa, and into parts of Illinois. So I show you these analogs simply because I want to show you what I'm looking at, but also with the qualifier that it doesn't always mean that's what's going to happen. We kind of have to watch this going forward. But the thing that I am interested in watching is that June through August, if you average those anomalies out, okay, you had dry in West Texas, dry in New Mexico, dry in Arizona, dry in Colorado. Northwest Kansas was not that wet. Most of Nebraska was in bad shape. There were some parts of Kansas that did okay during that time frame, but again, that kind of offsets a dry June with a dry August with a wet July, and that's kind of what you got. So that's kind of what I wanted to break that down for you to show you the differences in there and not just show you this map right here, which just kind of averages out those more extreme anomalies. In September to November of 2020, this is what we saw. The midsection of the country was largely dry, including Kansas. We had wildfires that were obviously raging into the fall out across parts of Colorado. So the dryness really started to take hold across all of the western United States and even the midsection of the country, September to November of 20. So with that in mind, let's see what the computer models show. And this was the May forecast from the Euro seasonal model that has actually done fairly well. You see it was wet across East Texas, Oklahoma, Southeast and East Kansas, all across the Corn Belt. We were drier back across New Mexico and parts of Colorado, and even right there into Southwest Kansas. So overall, the Euro model did a fairly good job here for the month of May, even across the northern plains. Actually, it's pretty impressive. If you look what it has in the June forecast, you see it still keeps a large part of Kansas slightly wetter than average. The southeast part of the state is obviously quite a bit wetter than average. But again, it's kind of owes to the fact that those areas that have been wet kind of stay wet. Those areas that were dry kind of stay drier. And the dry anomalies certainly are more favored out there across the Rockies than they are farther east. If you look at July, the midsection of the country still stays fairly wet, but you really start to dry out in northwest Kansas. All of Colorado's dry. The monsoon largely missing across Arizona, New Mexico, and that dry anomaly extends northward up into parts of the Rockies. If we look at August, same story. The wet stay wet, the dry stay dry. That doesn't change a whole lot until you get to September, where we really start to dry the pattern out, not just across Kansas, but regionally farther west. And that would kind of owe to that analog that I talked about of 2020, where the West really started to dry out in the fall and stayed fairly dry in the fall. So it's one of those things where, will we have enough moisture to get that wheat in the ground in the fall? I think that's a legitimate concern at this point with the way we're headed in terms of the La Nina, and certainly something that we'll have to watch pretty closely going forward. But even in November, drier than average certainly is the way to go here with the Euro model across all of Kansas for the most part. If we look at the temperature forecast, and I did just June, July, August with this, it's generally average to slightly warmer than average. But with the Euro model, again, where the soil is wetter, that's where it's keeping generally average temperatures and not blowing up the heat like areas farther west are, because the atmosphere and the soil moisture is a lot drier out there across parts of the Rockies. So that's something to keep in mind there. The NMME model has a similar flavor. This was the June forecast from it. You see it's wetter than average from north central Kansas all the way up into the northern plains and parts of the northern Rockies. The dry anomalies really start to show up there across New Mexico as well as Colorado, but most of Kansas does okay during the month of June. But then we start to see things dry out in July, especially western Kansas. And I think this owes to it being closer to the crux of where the dry anomalies are the most stout across the four corner states, that some of that dryness is going to start to bleed eastward. Obviously, that's still the case in August here. Western Kansas is the driest out of anything in the state. And then it makes good sense because it's closer to those really stout dry anomalies there across Colorado. If we look at September, this is again where we really start to dry out the whole region. No big surprises here with La Nina in full force. October, more of the same. Definitely drier than average, not only across Kansas, but regionally. If we go to November, the same. And I think we have one more. We go into December, and it's very much the same. So again, that would be the big thing that I worry about. Is there enough moisture during that late summer and early fall to get that wheat in the ground? I think that is something that we're going to have to not only just watch within the models, but just see how things kind of play out going forward. In terms of temperatures with the NMME model, this again is valid for June, July, August. It does have the crux of the heat through northern Mexico, West Texas, New Mexico, Southeast Colorado, and into western parts of Kansas. And that makes sense because the NMME model is drier for western Kansas than what the Euro model was. So again, I still think average to above average temperatures for the heart of the summer is definitely the way to go with this forecast. So keep this in mind, folks. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Over the next couple of weeks, I do want to say this, that while we haven't had a lot of severe weather in terms of hail across the western half of Kansas, for the most part, most of this real high-end severe weather has been biased a little farther east. I do think with this little switch in the weather pattern where the better storm chances are flexing a little bit farther west, there definitely will be some hail to contend with some of those higher end storms. So that's certainly something that I'm going to be watching closely on a day-to-day basis and do my best to keep you updated on in case you need to solicit some protection, obviously for your wheat crop, if you still have one, that is. So if I don't hear from you, I will be speaking to you guys again in June. Hope you guys are well and hope you stay that way. Take care.